I am joined here tonight by William Barr, who served as the former president's attorney general and who told him that his 2020 allegations of election fraud were not true, but has now said he will support the Republican ticket. Therefore, Donald Trump again. Mr. Attorney General, it's great to have you. I want to talk to you about how you're going to vote in 2024 in a moment. But, putting the merits aside, I like how you're laughing about that. Putting the merits aside, because I know you don't agree with the merits of the New York hush money case, but you worked for Donald Trump. You got to know him. What do you think it's like for him to be in court, being treated like any other criminal defendant and having to be there 4 days a week?
I think it's real tough on him, and I think a lot of the country sympathizes with him. So I think the longer the trial goes on, the more support he gets.
Well, I mean, he has claimed multiple times that this case is being brought essentially by President Biden. I mean, you know how this works and how the breakdown in this works. Presidents don't have any role in what a local district attorney, what case they bring.
That's normally true, and I'm not suggesting Biden is involved, but I think what they're saying is that this former federal official who's gone up to try the case, that this somehow shows a link. I don't know whether it does.
Yeah, but do you agree? I mean, you were the attorney general. Prosecutors leave and go work at other places all the time.
That's right. I think the impetus for this came from the New York prosecutors. I think that they're behind it.
And not President Biden.
I don't know.
But you have no basis to believe that the president would be in charge of an investigation that's being brought by the Manhattan District
Well, I don't
Attorney.
know. I don't think he's in charge of an investigation, but politics, this is a political case.
Your predecessor was brought up at the trial, Jeff Sessions, because David Pecker, this National Enquirer tabloid king, he got concerned at one point when he got a letter from the FEC, and he called Michael Cohen, then Trump's personal attorney, to voice concern about that. Michael Cohen told him not to worry because Jeff Sessions is the attorney general and Donald Trump has him in his pocket. Did Trump expect his AG to go easy on his friends?
I don't know. I don't know what he expected.
What was your experience?
My experience was, by the time I came in, he did not push me to do one thing or another on these criminal cases. Now, he tweeted and made his public views on things known, but he never talked to me about them directly.
So he did not have you in his pocket, you would argue?
It's not a question of arguing. I did what I thought was right.
And you never felt any direct pressure from him on what investigations the DOJ was carrying out?
No, he did not directly pressure me. As I say, he was out there tweeting and doing things that were embarrassing and made it hard for me to run the department.
That sounds like pressure.
It wasn't pressure. It was just, for example, I had decided that we were going to not agree to a sentence on Stone that was 3 times longer than normal, and I'd already decided that, and then he was tweeting about Stone, so it just made it harder to make the decision.
Because it looked like you were acting at his behest
Right.
on Roger Stone's sentence. What they were just talking about is this gag order and the alleged violations from the prosecutors here. They say it's about 14. It's pretty clear if you read the gag order and then you look at what Trump has been saying and posting about witnesses and even commenting on the jury here. What does a judge do to deter him? Do fines work? I mean, what do you believe the judge's options are here?
Well, I personally think the gag order could be too broad here, but I think Trump's, and I've said this before, I think Trump basically has the kind of personality that he's always testing the limit. He's always going further and further, and he's usually up against the line. So that's what gets him in trouble, and that's what creates all these cases like we're seeing now in the Supreme Court, very fundamental cases about our Constitution. Generally because of excess.
But do you think there's anything to he's testing that? I mean, how does a judge stop that?
I don't know.
You mentioned the Supreme Court and those very important oral arguments that happened yesterday. It was really fascinating to listen to them. But at one point, his attorneys did concede that some of what Jack Smith has alleged in his indictment are private acts, and they did concede private acts can be prosecuted. Mm-hmm. In your view, does that mean that this case can move forward, at least in part?
No, I don't think the case can move forward in part. I think that if Smith thinks he can try the case entirely and establish criminal liability just on the basis of private acts, he could. But if he requires some official acts, then he has a problem. I think the problem here is that the government, Smith, sought a very, he had this broad position that there was no immunity for official acts. And that's the basis on which it has gone up to the Supreme Court. And both sides are arguing this sort of abstract general idea. There's no immunity, and then Trump's people make it seem like there's immunity for everything, even things that are not official acts, like just if you use the military to do something, somehow you're immune because the instrumentality you use is federal.
To stage a coup,
Yeah,
not
I mean,
just to
that's
do
ridiculous.
anything.
Yeah, it's ridiculous because the question is this something you're authorized to do and have the duty to do and execute the law and so forth? And the answer obviously is not. The president does not have the authority to wage a coup against the Constitution of the United States. He doesn't have authority to kill enemies, to kill rivals and so forth. Those are obviously acts that are not authorized, they're not required for him to do his job.
So why do you think they're arguing this? Because they're doubling down. It was first the SEAL Team 6 can assassinate a political rival. Yesterday it was using the military to stage a coup. They said it would depend on the circumstances whether it counted as an official act.
But I don't know why they've taken those positions. I think, the issue is whether or not the president is carrying out one of his duties, and on the other hand, the extreme position taken by the government seems to be that you can be doing an official thing like firing the FBI director or something like that, something clearly within your discretion, and yet you can be prosecuted for a crime depending on a prosecutor saying, well, you did it for an illegitimate purpose. And that would just open Pandora's box. So,
well, I didn't hear the attorney for the federal government arguing that, but what I did hear Trump's attorneys arguing, and this is something that you'll know well about, is Trump's effort to install Jeffrey Clark as the acting Attorney General of the United States. And the point for why he wanted to do that was not just picking who he thought should be running the Justice Department after you left. It was because Jeffrey Clark was going to use the power of the federal government to pressure Georgia lawmakers to overturn their legitimate results. I mean, is that an official act of the President of the United States?
well, that's going to be in that gray zone that they're going to have to sort out. And that's why I feel it's going to have to go back to the district court. Was this the president seeing that the laws were faithfully executed, or was this a candidate trying to bully and press a state into changing its vote when he knew that the vote had been against him?
Well, you
And
were
that
there.
has to be sorted out.
You were there. Which one do you believe it is?
I'm not going to, I'd have to see all the evidence and see the case litigated.
You're one of few people. I mean, you were up there, up front and close and personal. Was he bullying people and trying to get them to carry out his will, his personal will to stay in office? Or was he carrying out, election integrity and making sure that the United States has fair elections?
But I wasn't happy with the way he behaved after the election, but whether it was a crime is a different issue. And that requires the government to articulate the basis of the crime and prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And some of these acts are gray acts. Some of these, it's difficult to say whether he was acting as a candidate or as the top law enforcement officer.
But which ones do you think are gray? Because you and I spoke right when this indictment came out, and you thought it was a pretty good indictment, a pretty solid indictment was, I believe, the word you used.
Well, I said, it was not an abuse, that it had a coherent theory. I said I didn't feel it was compelling, but it was coherent. I think the things that I think were private were the recruitment of the alternative slates and things like that were to me clearly as a candidate. But where you get into the gray zone is where he has an argument that, hey, I'm the president. I think this election was stolen. I am trying to see that the laws are faithfully executed. And there has to be some precision as to where exactly he crossed the line.
So when his attorney, who was seated right here last night, was arguing that the fake slates of electors do constitute an official act, you disagree with that?
I don't think they do. I think he was doing that as a candidate. I don't see why it's part of the president's official duties to recruit alternative slates to support him as a candidate. That seems to me to be not an official act.
When you see his attorneys, kind of brazenly arguing about that a military coup could be an official act, that ordering SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival could be an official act, do those arguments undermine the integrity of the justice system in
No,
the
I mean,
United
I think they
States?
undermine the case because they were stupid examples, in my opinion. So, for example, when President Obama sent a drone strike overseas and killed an American who was apparently in a terrorist complex, that was legitimate. That was the president using his national security powers. That was within the scope of his responsibilities. But that doesn't mean a president gets to shoot drones at domestic enemies to eliminate them, and just because they're military equipment, they become an official act. The president doesn't have the power to go around killing Americans at will.
I hear from a lot of Republicans who defend Trump saying, well, that's a hypothetical and that's ridiculous. But Alyssa Farah Griffin, who was Trump's communications director, posted yesterday and said that you were present at a moment when Trump suggested executing the person who leaked information that he went to the White House bunker when those George Floyd protests were happening outside the White House. Do you remember that?
I remember him being very mad about that. I actually don't remember him saying executing, but I wouldn't dispute it. I mean, it doesn't sound. The president would lose his temper and say things like that. I doubt he would have actually carried it out. I don't.
But he would say that on other occasions? You said
The
he would lose his
president,
temper.
the president had a. I think people sometimes took him too literally, and he would say things like similar to that in occasions to blow off steam, but I wouldn't take him literally every time he did it,
Why not?
because at the end of the day, it wouldn't be carried out, and you could talk sense.
But just because it's not carried out and you could talk sense into him, doesn't that still mean that the threat is there?
No, I mean, I think. I don't think the threat is there. The thing that I worry about President Trump is not that he's going to become an autocrat and do those kinds of things,
Why not?
because I don't think he would
But
at the end of the day.
what's the basis for that understanding that you have?
Well,
Or is it just your own hunch?
that's my feeling, having worked for him and seen him in action. I don't think he would actually go and kill political rivals and things like that.
If the January 6th case, the election interference case, doesn't move forward before the election, is that a mistake in your view?
If it doesn't move forward? No, I mean, I've said earlier on, I would have liked to see that tried before the election, but I think it's gotten too late.
But you were talking about Jack Smith and what he charged. Is in some part that the responsibility of the Supreme Court, that they could have heard these arguments back in December, they chose not to. They could rule sooner. They may not rule until June. I mean, they have a role in this as well.
No, I think it was teed up for them, and they acted very quickly to actually take the case quickly. And I think it hasn't been well prepared. I think that the circuit court didn't do its job. It should have sent it back for a fuller record. And I think the Supreme Court is doing the best they can under these circumstances.
Last time you and I spoke, when we had you on the show, you told me that you would jump off the bridge when it came to it on who you were going to support in the 2024 election. It appears that you have jumped off that bridge because you said recently you were going to vote for the Republican ticket come November, which means you're going to vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I said that's what I plan to do at this stage.
You're saying you could change your mind, maybe?
Well, I'm not going to vote for Biden, this is a wild time. Who knows what's going to happen in 7 months? But I expect, as between Trump and Biden, there's no question in my mind.
Oh, so you're kind of suggesting maybe Donald Trump may not be the Republican nominee?
Or Biden may not be their Democrat.
So you would vote for another Democrat if a different Democrat was on the ticket?
It's hard to imagine that this party, the Progressive Democratic Party, would nominate someone I would support.
Yeah, I know you disagree with him, but I have to ask you about something that Trump posted about you this week, because he responded in response to you saying you'd vote for the Republican ticket. Wow, former AG Bill Barr, who let a lot of great people down by not investigating voter fraud in our country, has just endorsed me for president despite the fact that I called him weak, slow-moving, lethargic, gutless, and lazy. Based on the fact that I greatly appreciate his wholehearted endorsement, I am removing the word lethargic from my statement. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah. It's classic Trump. What's the question?
What's your response?
Well, I mean, obviously, what I said was that I'm very disappointed that this country is stuck with this choice between two people who I don't think either of them should be president of the United States. But given that binary choice, I feel I have to choose Trump.
But he's mocking you.
So it's not about me. I think that that I've said this all along, if faced with a choice between two people, neither of which I think should be president, I feel it's my duty to pick the person who I think would do the least damage to the country. And I think Trump would do less damage than Biden. And I think all this stuff about a threat to democracy, I think the real threat to democracy is the progressive movement and the Biden administration.
The Biden administration or President Biden himself?
Biden's support for the progressive agenda.
I think a lot of people hear that, and the case that we just talked about that went before the Supreme Court essentially, and say, how can you see that and say that Biden is a greater threat to democracy?
Well, where are we losing our freedoms? How are our freedoms being constrained? They're being constrained by the progressive government. And, democracy, especially, from the Anglosphere democracies, the Five Eyes and so forth, the threat's never been for autocratic government on the right.
But how specifically is Biden threatening democracy?
The threat to freedom and democracy has always been on the left. It's the collectivist, socialist agenda. And that is where we're losing our freedom. Parents are losing the freedom to control their children's education. People can't speak their mind without losing their jobs and things like that. This is worse than the McCarthy era. Where is that coming from? It's not coming from the right.
Those two things that you just noted there, you believe are worse than a president of the United States trying to subvert the will of the people by overturning the results of the election?
I think a country, all the things together, like we're not enforcing our borders, we have open borders, we have lawlessness in our cities. We have regulations coming fast and furious, so telling people what kind of stoves they can use and what kinds of cars they have to drive, and eliminating cars and so forth. Those are the threats to democracy.
But President Biden is not in control of what some school boards across the country are doing.
He's using the administrative.
You can make that argument, but how is that the same thing?
Major changes are being made in our country without the democratic process, and they're being made by bureaucrats in these agencies.
Pause. You cannot argue that Republicans across the country are not doing that as well. In my own hometown, there's a huge fight at the library over which books kids can read. This is not something that is a single-party fight.
Do you think don't you think there should be some limits on what people are able to read at very young ages?
I just think people look at what you're saying and they don't.
Well, some people might.
Maybe even Republicans who have concerns about what's happening with school boards or the culture. And maybe abortion even, don't equate that with January 6th and Trump's efforts. When you told him the election was not stolen, and he still went out there and said it was stolen and led a lot of people to believe that. Those things aren't equal. It feels like a false equivalency.
Well, I disagree. I think the country is much more susceptible to losing freedoms by the excesses of the left, and they have been steadily, and that's clear. People lose their jobs. Kids can't speak out in the classroom. They have to go along with what the professor says in order to get good grades and so forth. It's become like a Stepford nation being directed by the progressive elites.
Republicans are also trying to limit what can be said in the classroom. But I do want to ask you, because you're a lifelong Republican, I don't think it's a surprise that you don't like those issues that a lot of Republicans blame on Democrats. I think there's a question of how they're the same. But I'd want you to listen to what another lifelong Republican, Liz Cheney, said about your decision to vote for the Republican ticket in November.
Given what Bill Barr has said publicly about Trump's lack of fitness for office, I think that his assertion now that he's actually going to support Trump for office is indefensible, and was frankly disappointing to see.
She says it's indefensible.
Well, that's her view. That's her view. The fact of the matter is, as I said all along, I agreed with Trump's policies, and despite the media, the left-wing media's effort to portray it as a lawless administration, it wasn't. His policies were sound, and we had victories in courts, and we defended them. I think that Biden is unfit for office.
So you're basically saying that you are voting because you want the Republican policies?
Well, that's certainly part of it.
Well, I'm glad
but
you
I
said
also,
that.
But I also don't
Hold on,
think...
hold on. I'm glad you said that because you told Geraldo Rivera last year, you may want his policies, but Trump will not deliver Trump policies. He will deliver chaos and, if anything, lead to a backlash that will set his policies much further back than they would otherwise be. You're even acknowledging he can't accomplish those Republican policies.
What I was saying was, if you want Trump's policies, if you're MAGA and want to make America great again, the other candidates will be successful at that much more than he will.
But
For
there's
the
not
reasons
the other
I stated.
candidates. It's going to be Donald Trump.
That's right. I'm certainly not going to get anywhere near what I'd like under Biden. And Biden is not a great moral exemplar. Okay? And is he following the laws? Here he is giving away another round of forgiving student loans after he lost it in the Supreme Court, and he thinks he can get away. And he thinks he can get away with it by getting it out the door before the election.
But
He's not enforcing the law on the borders.
But those are policy differences that you disagree with. Trump, I remember also when border numbers were at an all-time high in the spring of 2019. So the idea that border chaos only happens under this administration is inaccurate. But I think people
No, wait
see
a minute.
that.
We had it under control because we had a program approved by the Supreme Court called Remain in Mexico that was fully lawful and had shut down the border, and he came in and lifted it.
How can you equate, the border is a real issue. I've been to the border. No one's denying that. But is that the same thing as what you said recently, which was that, you know, the conduct that was involved with Donald Trump? You said trying to subvert and prevent the progress, the execution of probably the most important process we have, which is the peaceful transfer of power after an election. Name one thing that Biden has done that's worse than that.
I think his whole administration is a disaster for the country.
Is worse than subverting the peaceful transfer of power?
Did he succeed?
Only because Vice President Mike Pence stood in the way, and now the people who are lining
He
up to
tried
be
to
VP again say that they will not do what Mike Pence did.
I mean, look, I was very loud in saying I thought it was the whole episode was shameful, and I'm very troubled by it, and that's why it's not an easy decision. But I think when you have a Hobson's choice, you have to pick the lesser of two evils.
You don't see this as the definition of putting party over country?
No. No, not because unfortunately we're in a situation where the policy differences between the two parties are very, very vast. There's a huge gulf, and so in that
But you're saying Trump can't achieve the policies.
I think he's going to have a much harder time achieving them.
But you're voting for So just to be clear, you're voting for someone who you believe tried to subvert the peaceful transfer of power, that can't even achieve his own policies, that lied about the election even after his attorney general told him that the election wasn't stolen. And as the former chief law enforcement in this country, you're going to vote for someone who is facing 88 criminal counts.
Well, look, the 88 criminal counts, a lot of those are, and I've said...
Even if 10 of them are accurate?
The answer to the question is yes. I'm supporting the Republican ticket.
But can you say that you're voting for Donald Trump? Because you're not saying his name. You just say you're supporting the Republican ticket.
I've said, as between Biden and Trump, I will vote for Trump, because I believe he will do less damage over the 4 years. I believe we're facing the most dangerous situation we've ever faced in the world, a lot of it invited by Biden's weakness. And to have Biden out there for the next 4 years, given all the threats we face, including handing the keys to the nuclear weapon to Iran, with a vice president like Kamala Harris, endangers the country. That alone should be reason to vote for the Republican ticket. But there are a host of other reasons. Our country is unraveling in many ways. The rule of law is unraveling.
So you want to put someone back in the position with immense power who you believe disrespects the rule of law?
Well, no, I think he will enforce the law, and we'll have greater safety in our cities.